Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining our Threat Metrics Masterclasses this afternoon. I'm glad to see there's a few people who've managed to make it on the last afternoon of the conference. I'm going to kick off the first of three sessions that Threat Metrics is running. My colleague is going to be digging into a bit more detail, certainly more technical details than I am in the next few sessions. But we're going to focus on well, for me, I'm going to focus on what we refer to as the digital identity revolution. And before I really explain to you what Threat Metrics views as a digital identity and how that can help in securing your digital business and making it easier for your customers to do business based on global shared intelligence, I thought it would probably make sense actually to take a little step back. I think that there's a lot of people at the conference don't really know who Threat Metrics is and what they do. So I'm going to actually step back a little bit in time and give you a bit of a background as to where we've come from our early starts 10 years ago to really give you an idea of what it is we've done, what we do today, and how that ties into this concept of digital identities. So if we go back to 2009, that's when we first had a commercially available product. We played in the online payment fraud detection space. So we were a fraud detection company, we still are today, and our first customers were in the e-com space and all the way through that payment journey. So we were focused on stopping CMP fraud specifically. And the way our solution worked and still works is you can think of it as being broken down into two parts. There's a part that gathers intelligence around events that are occurring online, and then there's a part that is a rules engine that analyzes that intelligence and helps to make a risk-based decision for our customers to determine how to proceed with those events. So back almost 10 years ago, payment fraud was the place to be, and we were looking really to detect relatively simple attack vectors with the intelligence that we gathered. So you can think of things like device identification, understanding if criminals were coming back using the same device multiple times and testing different cards, for example, hiding their location, so proxy, the detection of proxies, being able to pierce or bypass those to identify where the end user really was important. Other relatively simple pieces of intelligence like that. And we would turn up at conferences with Natasha and Gromko there, and it was all relatively light-hearted. But then we started expanding globally, and our Russian customers weren't quite as amused by that, so we don't use them anymore. But it was a fun time. Payment fraud is still a big business for us. About 40% of our business comes from the e-commerce customer base that we have. And we still see a lot of payment fraud today. So this is actually an example relatively recently, a fraudster in Brazil using a single device, carrying out lots of $5 payments with 50 different credit cards, all within a minute and a half, but using a proxy in the US. So that it just adds that little bit of complexity. So if you don't have any of this intelligence in place, it just looks like 50 different people with different credit cards making purchases online. What we do see now is that those kind of attacks tend to shift away from the larger e-commerce retailers and are attacking the more vulnerable. So the non-profit organizations who maybe have less sophisticated intelligence and technology layers in place, they're also trying to minimize any barriers in place to donate. And so they're then kind of interesting for the fraudsters to carry on with these simple kinds of attacks. A couple of years later, we expanded into the account takeover space. So we started working more with the financial sector, and the financial sector was dealing with more sophisticated attacks on their online banking channels. So you could think of things like malware, man-in-the-browser malware in particular, the use of Tor networks, more sophisticated bot attacks, and more recently, things like remote access Trojans. So the intelligence that we gathered needed to expand to handle those kind of attack vectors. And so the example here is actually a relatively recent example where the little dots there going from green, red, orange, and green are reflecting logins into an online banking account where the first three green logins are a good customer accessing their account. And then suddenly the red login reflects a fraudster accessing the account. And the way the access actually happened was Through the non-digital channel, through the telephony channel, the fraudster had managed to change the cell number and the email address associated with that account, so that when they logged into the account through the digital channel with a new device from an unusual location, and they were challenged correctly through multi-factor authentication, they still managed to actually beat all of those challenges. And there was a period of time where they were able to access the account, take money out. And interestingly enough, the orange dots that you see further along there are the good customer accessing their account again for a period of time after the compromise, not actually being able to identify that their email and their other personal details had been changed. It was only a period of time afterwards that the understanding occurred of how the account was compromised and the personal details were set up again. So with ThreatMetrix intelligence in place, we basically would look at that red dot and say, this is an unusual device accessing the account, and then we would look in the other intelligence to give extra indicators of whether this is the customer just having got a new device or whether there's something more going on there. And we'll come back to that as we go through the presentation to give you an idea of how we look at that intelligence to try and understand that difference. And leading on from really looking purely from the fraud side point of view, we started having more discussions with the authentication teams within the financial sector as well, because they were looking very much at how do we go from a multi-factor authentication where you're always being pushed to the second factor or using tokens to a more risk-based approach. And the later sessions this afternoon from ThreatMetrix, I know that my colleague Himanshu is going to be talking more around that risk-based approach, how we do that, how we can plug in, for example, into ping and offer that intelligence into that authentication process. More recently, the third primary use case that we are involved with is new application or new account fraud or new account originations. There's a number of different terminologies for this, also based on different geographies. But you can think of anything like applying online for a new account, a new loan, new credit. But also within this wrapper, I tend to classify also just new mobile device registrations. So you download an app for the first time onto your device and that initial registration process that you go through. The reason this is a focus really right now is for a few reasons. But one is it's often really the weak link still, certainly in the consumer space, where the fraudsters can get in. So the payment side, there's a lot of layers of protection there. The login stage, the authentication around that, and account takeover protection is not at all bad. But as enterprises have allowed this new application side through the digital channel, that actually poses different problems. One of the problems is if that is a new customer, new to bank or new to whatever the enterprise is, you have no history on that customer. You don't know. Whatever intelligence you can gather on that single event doesn't necessarily lead you to be able to make a clear decision of whether they're good or bad. A new customer, new employee or agent, but also then coming back to the mobile device registrations, the new device itself. How do I know, let's take an online banking world. I already have registered with online banking, I use it on a regular basis, but one day there's a new mobile device that comes in and downloads the app and associates with the account. How does the bank know that it's me, I've got a brand new device and therefore I'm installing the app again, and it's not Laura, the fraudster, who has got a new device, has managed to get my credentials and installs the app and pretends to be me? It's a really interesting problem, and it's, I would say, the area where our customers are really fighting the most with at the moment. That's where there's certainly a cat and mouse game still going on there. We publish a cybercrime report every quarter, and the way we do that is that the intelligence that we gather from the events that we analyze from our customers goes into a global shared intelligence network. So we're a cloud-only provider. We analyze around 80 million events on a daily basis, and that allows us to also analyze that data for trends, for attacks, for different things that occur. So we publish this cybercrime report on a quarterly basis to share some of these trends that we see with the public. And if we look at a couple of things from the Q4 last year report, This is actually showing the attack breakdown in that last quarter of last year. So first of all, to explain a little bit, on the left-hand side, it's actually just showing of those 3 primary use cases that I talked about, so logins, payments, and new account openings or applications. The majority of the events that we monitor today are logins. Naturally, really, when you just think about it, just how many times you log into something, not all of those then result in transactions, for example. The second most important factor, almost a quarter of the events, are payments. And then a relatively small percentage are those new account creation events. But if you look on the right-hand side and you look at the reject rates that we see, so the high risk classified events classified by our customers, it's around those account creations where they see the most threat and the most risk. So actually 4 times as many high-risk events are seen in that account creation space than in the login space, for example. In addition to those 3 use cases and the issues there, we also then see that threat detection continues to evolve. There are always new threats emerging, and you're constantly having to react to them. So in the example here, this is actually looking at bots and how bots have also really evolved over time. So maybe 5-10 years ago, bots were arguably relatively simple to detect. They were generally high velocity, coming from specific sources, and you could put layers of detection around those bots to keep them out of your sites. And what we're seeing nowadays is that they're becoming much more sophisticated. They're becoming what we term slow and low bots, where those bots will distribute across the botnet using many different IPs, touching individual accounts only once, keeping under the radar. And what the 2 graphs here are showing are over a 3-month period of time for 2 large US retailers, e-retailers, the percentage of the transactions that they're seeing which are actually bot traffic. And I don't know if it's easy to read or not, the y-axis there, but these are going up to 80 or 90%. So as we go through this 3-month period, we're often seeing that anywhere between 50 to 80% of the traffic coming to those sites, trying to pay or trying to log into accounts, is malicious bot traffic, trying to break into the accounts, working through lists of compromised identities and credentials, trying to get in there. So that's another threat that you have to deal with. Conversely, what we also see within the data is that as this network has grown and we've focused up to now very much on the threats, there's also the positive side. So the amount of returning customers is also growing. So what we're showing here in the graphic on the right-hand side is data from the Thanksgiving holiday week last year. And what we looked at was how many times are we seeing multiple transactions in the network from the same customer. Only 25% of all the transactions we saw during that week were individual single events from a customer. So what I mean by that is that 75% of the customers were transacting multiple times within our network. So we don't see all the traffic, but even within our network, because it's now grown so large, 75% of the traffic was actually returning customers that we could analyze multiple times through that week. 39% were actually transacting 5 times or more in that week. And that then opens up opportunities as well. So in addition to looking for threats, you can also start looking for returning customers, returning good and normal behavior. So then if you think back to the authentication layer, you can start saying, how can I use that information not only to identify when there's a threat, but actually relax and improve the customer experience through that authentication layer. And I would say that the majority of our customers today, the focus for them is really on using this positive intelligence within the global network versus the threats. They have the threats reasonably well under control. You've always got to keep an eye on them and change on them, but how can you leverage that positive data to make your experience through the authentication layer, whether it's consumers or not, whether it's agents or workforce, how can you make that a more pleasant experience based on intelligence that you have and that you can gather around that event and the behavior that they normally exhibit when they're interacting in the digital world? So that then comes on to the main focus for the discussion of this session is around digital identities. So ThreatMetrix has a very specific concept of what we refer to as a digital identity, and I'm going to talk through that a bit. And then we're also going to visualize that a little bit, understand what it really means when we look in our data. So identity is more than just who I am. You really have to look at it in the digital space from two different sides. You've got the end user themselves accessing services online, and they're in the back of their mind, they're hopefully always questioning a little bit, am I really accessing the site that I think I'm accessing, or using the app that I think I'm accessing? How do I know that it's really the entity that I think it is? And what do they actually need to know about me? I want to share as little as possible with this entity, and I also want to make sure that they don't misuse that information. On the other side, the entity, the enterprise, how do I know that the person on the other end really is the person that they claim to be? And can we really transact? Can we trust this person and transact with them? And maybe going a step further, what kind of services can we offer them if we really know it's them? And how can we personalize that experience? So if you consider the digital identity versus the traditional identity, there's really, at least from our point of view, a real fundamental difference here. So in the traditional identity space, I have a passport, for example, and with that passport, that's my identity. I can use that as a verification stage. In the physical world, I can go and apply for a bank account, I can buy airline tickets, I can go and start purchasing things with the credit card that I get from the bank after I've validated who I am. And then I start transacting with my credit card. I can start buying things, and over time, over a period of time, I build up a certain behavior stereotype in that physical world, the kinds of shops I visit, the kind of things I buy, how I travel. But it ultimately all comes back from that initial identity. I have to prove right at the beginning who I am through some kind of physical passport or other identity device. In the digital world, you're really turning it completely on its head. From a ThreatMetrix point of view, we start really with a set of transactions that we see. There are no identities. There are just transactions, these millions of transactions that we evaluate on a daily basis. And over a period of time, so sure, we're always looking at individual transactions and looking for anomalies, looking for those risky clues, those high-risk events that I mentioned about. But we're also over time starting to build up behavioral patterns of those transactions. We're going to start being able to link those transactions together and classify them into what we refer to ultimately as digital identities. And as that grows into that global network, you ultimately have a global network out of which these identities form, rather than in the traditional world where everything starts from the identity itself. What does that mean in a little bit more detail? Well, if you just think online, and I'm sure this applies to all of you as well, if I log into eBay, I have an ID with eBay, Stepen Topliss, for example. If I log into Facebook, I might be using stopliss@threatmetrix.com. So eBay and Facebook, they see me as two different people. They have no way to join the dots there. I know it's me at both of those accounts. ThreatMetrix sees all of these events from all these different clients of ours, including eBay and Facebook. And so within the ThreatMetrix Global Intelligence Network, we actually can join those dots. We can see that this is, for example, the same device or the same location accessing these two different services with these two different identities, but can start linking them together to start forming a digital identity that can then over time really define who I am online, and then the next time I'm accessing a service, ThreatMetrix can look and say, yes, this is Stepen, and this is part of his digital identity, and therefore I can start assigning a certain amount of trust to that. So in a little bit more detail, the way ThreatMetrix looks at that and builds that network of data is that over a period of time, so taking, say, a 24-hour period, I can see different events occurring in different places. It could be that I really can break that down into a business identity or business persona and a personal persona. So maybe they're differentiated quite clearly because I've got personal and business email addresses, and I carry out different events. So I may be enrolling for a new insurance on the business side, checking email on my mobile device, booking a business trip. And then on the personal side, I'm checking my email with a different device. I'm buying a few things online. I'm using social media. But there's enough commonality between the devices I use, the identities I use, the locations I use, to bring those multiple personas into one global digital identity. If you're going to build that digital identity, though, it's important that the data you use is global. And I think that last slide really kind of emphasizes that in order to really be able to create a digital identity that's meaningful and useful, you need to have that data coming from those different sources to really be able to link it all together. One single enterprise is only ever going to be able to form a relatively simplistic digital identity related to the customer base of that enterprise. So again, coming back to the Cybercrime Report that we publish, one of the statistics from that is as we see more and more of our customers using our data to promote trust around either the login populations or the payment populations, we can see very clearly a significant uplift when a customer is just looking at, for example, is this a device I've recognized before, versus is this actually a digital identity, a global digital identity that's been seen before across the network. Generally, we see a 55% increase in the percentage of events or transactions that can be classified as trusted when you take full advantage of that global network and that digital identity concept rather than purely looking at a device level. So we see more and more then that this concept of the digital identity ultimately becomes, if you like, a currency of trust. It enables you as the enterprise to understand the relationship between these different identity attributes. You can then distinguish much more clearly good from bad. You can cross-correlate outside of your own business. And then you're not just relying on static, traditional models looking for risks and threats within the space. So let's actually try and make this a little bit real. So I'm going to show you a couple of examples of what this really looks like within the ThreatMetrix data. We're going to look at what we refer to as a digital identity graph. And it's really what the digital identity graph is doing. It's constantly mapping all the different associations between key things. So between people, devices, location, credentials, behaviors. And importantly, it's doing it in an anonymized way. So any of the identity information, like an email address or things like that, as that goes into the global network, it's salted and hashed and anonymized. So that helps and is always an important concern for all of our customer base around the privacy aspect as well. But then in that way, that network is enabling all of the customer base to benefit from the intelligence that's gathered across the network. So let's have a look what this looks like in reality. Let's take a real example from the data of an identity. So here, the red dot here, this is a device, an Android device linked to an email and a name. Let's consider then what else we can see. So here's another device. This is actually an iPad, and it's connected to the same email. Okay, so the red dots are indicating devices. So here on the left-hand side is another device. This is a PC now, again linked to that email. So if I look at the digital identity as a whole, then what you're seeing here is a digital identity represented by 4 different devices linked to one consistent email, and there's also a name there as well. And you'll see, as I mentioned earlier about the anonymization, you're not seeing the email address. You're seeing a unique hash there, and same with the name. The orange dots there, just to explain what they are, the orange dots actually represent our clients. So this digital identity is basically supported by the data linked to 4 clients within the network. And so the way the graph is formed is that over a period of time, as you see repeated events linking these different elements of the identity together, you then get to a certain stage where the algorithm says, okay, we have enough history here to be clear to define this is what we refer to as a digital identity. So the next time some of these components come in on an event and ThreatMetrix can analyze that event, we'll be able to ascertain, yes, this forms part of that digital identity there. Now, at that stage, all we're doing is validating that the person interacting at that stage is part of this known digital identity. There's then a second step around understanding, is it a good or a bad identity? This could be a bad actor who is consistently carrying out fraudulent events online, but consistently with this digital identity, with this persona. So there's a second part of understanding how is this digital identity actually received within the network? How is it interpreted and analyzed by the risk-based rules that sit on top of it there? And then that can also be part of the ultimate risk analysis at the moment that this digital identity then interacts with your site. How does this look like if we look at something a little bit different? So let's consider the bot example. I mentioned earlier that we're seeing more and more bots. We've got a rather simplistic bot here. And what you'll see here straight away, there's one device, the red device in the middle, and all those identities spiraling all around from outside of it. But actually, let's take a look on the left-hand side. If we click on the email here just to highlight it, this is the same digital identity that we just saw on the last chart. So actually, the email address is being tested by the bot on the right-hand side. And this is really where being able to visualize the data is really quite powerful and really gives you an insight into what's happening there, because you have actually a perfectly good digital identity on the left-hand side, and you have this bot on the right-hand side, which is working through a list of compromised credentials, probably come from a particular breach somewhere, and testing them one by one. And you'll also see there's a number of the orange dots. So the bot is hitting a number of different online sites to test this out. Now, just because that email address is being tested by a bot doesn't actually mean that the digital identity on the left-hand side is compromised. It does mean that that email address is being tested somewhere. And so it's important to also be able to not only visualize and understand what's going on, but have rules that can be sophisticated enough to not just bring that bot in and say, well, that bot's now part of this digital identity, because that's not going to help you. You still need to be able to separate these two components here. If I see that digital identity on the left-hand side in the future, trying to transact or log into an account or whatever they're doing in the digital world, provided they're using the standard components of that digital identity, the same devices, the same locations and behavior, again, we can pretty much certainly make the assumption it's the right person, and we should let them through without impacting them, without pushing them through more multi-factor authentication, for example. But at the same time, understanding that that bot is there on the right-hand side, and understanding what's going on in the behavior there, if that email address is popping up somewhere and you see it associated with the bot's device, or any other device, for example, or location that falls outside of the normal digital identity behavior that you see on the left-hand side, that's when you raise the risk. So it's important to understand that the concept of that digital identity is more than just relating those simple attributes together. Sure, you relate them together, but you also need to understand when you've seen enough consistency in the identity to actually say, yes, these are definitely always joined together, versus there's a link between this identity and a bot like we saw on the last slide. And that's one of the things that we really have learned as we've become better at visualizing the data that we have in our network, that in order to get the most benefit out of the solution, it's a combination of the data, the quality of that data, and the quantity absolutely as well, but also the model quality that's analyzing the data. And if you can get the two applied together, then you're going to get really the best results. And here's actually an example. This is another example from our Cybercrime Report of two different examples of good and bad model results, actually. So this is, again, real data. This is a consumer who travels a lot. They're based in North America, but they also travel to France quite a lot. And between February and May this year, they carried out a number of digital transactions, depending on where they were located, either in the US or in France. As you can see from the descriptions, they did a number of different things. They were buying things, they were logging into various financial services, they were paying their taxes. And all of the green ticks there are basically highlighting their digital transactions that were accepted and passed by the different ThreatMetrix customers. there's one red cross on the right-hand side by a retailer when they were in France that was actually rejected. When you actually go back and look and analyze the data, you can see absolutely certainly that this was one digital identity that was carrying out all of these transactions. They were all legitimate transactions. And the reason that the red cross was there was that the analysis, the models, and the rules that were put in place by these different clients of ThreatMetrix, most of them have been focusing on embracing the concept of looking for trust and not just looking for threats. The last retailer was actually a retailer that hadn't done that, and they still were stuck very rigidly to having a set of rules in place that was always looking for threats, always looking for anomalies and anything that was suspicious, and they saw this person in the wrong part of the world trying to transact with a US enterprise and immediately blocked it. But if they'd actually expanded their rule set to consider the digital identity and the full global data, they would have been able to accept the transactions in the same way that the other enterprises on the right-hand side did, regardless of where the customers are located. So, as I mentioned before, it's really about having the data and also the analysis. So just kind of summing up over the last few slides here, just to give you an idea of the data and the size of the network, you need to have a large network to really be able to start joining the dots together with the digital identities. So what does that really mean? So within the network, we have somewhere around 800 million unique anonymized email addresses floating around there. We have 4.5 billion devices in there. We're serving pretty much every country in the globe in some way, and I'll touch on that in a little bit more detail in a second. And we're processing then 70 or 80 or 90 million events every day, so 20 billion annual network transactions go in there. And once you start getting to that scale, you really can see those repetitive events linked to those individual identities. You can start drawing them together and building those global digital identities that we've been looking at here. So I thought actually for this, since I had a bit of time left over, I'd just actually see how often are we seeing data from the different countries, for example. So let me go on to this slide. In 1 second, the events that are analyzed in 1 second by our network now, in 1 second we see transactions coming from 50 different countries. And if you extend that to a minute, we're seeing 160 countries. And by the time you get to an hour, we've seen all of the countries. The number here is slightly different from the number before, because if you use, depending on what standard you use, if you use the ISO 3166 standard, there are 249 countries and territories. So this is basically where this came from. And if you explore the 9 territories that aren't in this list, there's a few kind of uninhabited islands out there and things like that. So we'd be quite surprised if we saw any events coming from there. So that's the data, that's great, but so coming back to the model as well, it's important to look beyond maybe the traditional rules that are in place. And I guess I'm always looking a little bit from kind of historically, as I mentioned at the beginning, from a fraud point of view and the fraud engines and the rule sets historically in place. They're often very static rules, but also just from an authentication point of view, often quite static rules about when do I go through multi-factor, when do I challenge, when do I not challenge. And we've spent a lot of time expanding the analytical capabilities over the last couple of years to enable customers to take advantage of that data fully, because it's very difficult to do it with static rules. Even if you have that data there and those digital identities there, how do you really benefit from it? So you really need to look at adding 2 extra things into the mix. One is behavioral analytics, and this is behavior from the point of view of rules-based behavior, looking over multiple events and looking for historic behavior there. And secondly, if you have the opportunity to apply machine learning techniques across it, that certainly becomes more and more valuable as the data set grows, just helping you with the sheer volume of the data there to identify, what's really interesting. So from a behavior analytics point of view, what's interesting there and from a high level how it works in our systems is you have the ability to, over the top of all of the raw data that's gathered and analyzed and the intelligence that we have, you're able to generate behavioral variables that calculate for every single event that you monitor. And those variables are calculated in real time, and they can be simple or more complex mathematical calculations or simple counts. So for example, in a login scenario, I might want to count how many different unique devices access my account on a regular basis. So this is calculated not at the enterprise level or the channel level, but it's calculated at the customer level or the employee level or at the account level or at the device level or at the digital identity level. And so in that example, I would be able to see at the account level how many unique devices generally access that account, which is going to be very different from the next account who has a different set of devices. Creating those different behavioral variables then allows you to do dynamic analysis of historic versus current values at the moment that a login occurs, for example. So this login is occurring, it's coming from a brand new device. Is that usual for this account? Do they change devices a lot? Or is there a certain threshold that I don't want to set manually to say, well, every account can only be accessed by 3 devices? I want to set it dynamically. If this account normally has 5 devices accessing it versus another account who only ever has 1 device being accessed, then let's dynamically look for when something changes in the account access rather than having that static threshold of 3. So behavioral analytics really gives you the ability at the customer or the end user level to really tweak how you analyze the data at the moment of authentication, for example. And then from a machine learning point of view, there's a number of different ways to approach that, but it's really, in our mind, certainly with our larger customers, you need some automated capabilities to be honing in or tweaking the rules and those behavioral variables that we mentioned to identify which are the ones that actually have impact, which are the ones have high correlation with identifying good customers or identifying threats. And if you can do that, if you can use machine learning in what we call a clear box approach, so that the actual outputs of the machine learning model are understandable by your analysts, your administrators, then you can also combine machine learning results with your actual normal business rules that you have in place there. And so if things change over time and the model changes, you can understand why the model changed and is there a reason to adjust and update. So in summary, when we look at how the data has grown and data that we capture has grown to an extent that we have such a large global network, we're able to really focus and start building these digital identities. If you're able to use these, you really need to focus on a few key things. You need to focus on having that access to global shared intelligence. You need to be able to, ideally, from an analyst point of view, analysts love to be able to visualize those graphs, but regardless of whether you can visualize them or not, you need to have the analytical capabilities to actually draw the intelligence out of that data so you can actually use it usefully. And then the data itself, you need to have a large amount of data, but it needs to be, the quality of the data needs to be good as well. And quality means a number of different things, but for example, you need to, when you're gathering the intelligence into the network, you need to have a sufficient amount of different attributes there, and that combination of digital intelligence that you can gather directly combined with the actual identity information like an email address, like a name, like a location, to actually join the dots together there as well. So that's the end of my, I guess, kind of maybe slightly high-level introduction of what ThreatMetrix does and our overall concept of the digital identity network. In the next couple of sessions, we're going to be drilling into a lot more technical detail about how it really works. But for me, that's what I wanted to present, so I'm going to stop there. If there are any questions, happy to take them now. We've got a microphone as well.
We do. It's very official.
So is this tool used at the federal level? I could definitely see something like this used from a threat aspect and then shared out, to the private sector accordingly.
So, our focus is really the general private and public sector. We work with public sector. We don't really work with the federal side as much. That's not where our focus is. I would say if we looked at our customer base, about 40 to 50% of our business is traditional online e-commerce. Okay. We have about 40% in the finance sector. That's, for us, the largest growing sector today globally. And then we also work with more social media types. Those are our main focuses.
I got you. So just private sector.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
Okay.
as of the last year, we have been making inroads into the federal and state and local governments. It's a long process, as you know, though. So
Yeah.
we're well on our way. We'll see.
Okay.
Could definitely see the
Yeah.
usage.
And who do you work for?
I work for Centene Healthcare.
Oh, awesome. Okay, thank you. Other questions? Yeah.
Hi, I work for Motorola Solutions. Just want to know that how this is more like a concept and a product too, right? So how can we have this merging or integration done with any as-is process or the product that we currently have in our environment?
Sorry, could you repeat the question? I didn't.
Yeah, so we have like products for access and identity management.
Okay.
Yeah, so if you want to have some integration done with this, then what's the way to go?
Right. So the simple answer is if you can stay for the second session, my colleague's going to dig into more detail there. So he's
Okay.
going to talk about, for example, how we integrate with ping and things like that. So
Okay.
rather than
Yeah, that sounds
taking
good.
his show away, I'll leave that for Himanshu.
Yeah, that will be good then.
Any other
Who are
questions?
you with? Sorry?
Was that?
Who are you with?
Motorola.
Okay, thanks. Any other questions?
Okay. Well, thank you very much. One more. Yeah.
Apart from providing the global identification type of services, do you have any other use cases wherein the data collected probably can be utilized, or more of the analytics that can be utilized? Right?
So apart from the digital identity and apart from the three primary use cases I mentioned, so we certainly have customers that use us in a number of different use cases. It's always on the digital channel, whether it's web or mobile, native app, any kind of event where there is a potential risk associated, they can use our technology to gather intelligence at the moment that event occurs. So for example, in an online banking world, the primary use case would be at the moment of login, but actually the banks tend to use us numerous touch points through that customer session to understand what else is maybe happening besides what happens at the moment of the login. So am I creating a new beneficiary? Am I changing my personal details? Am I doing a password reset? Those are all different events with a risk associated with them, and therefore we can also be applied to make a risk-based decision at that moment as well. Okay, thank you. So I think we've probably got a 10 to 15 minute break before we kick off the next session. Thank you.